Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode of From the Editor's Desk with Compliance Week Editor-in-Chief, Aaron Nicodemus. This is a podcast where we unpack some of the top stories which either have or may will appear in Compliance Week, look at other top stories that have piqued Aaron's interest, and we generally try to solve the world's problems. I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Aaron Nicodemus, Editor-in-Chief at Compliance Week. I'm thrilled to be able to join Tom today to bring some of the top stories that Compliance Week is following. And
we need to stop. I can barely hear you. Do you have some earbuds or something you could slap in?
Okay, do I need to redo anything here?
We'll just start over, but that's much better. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with another episode of From the Editor's Desk with Aaron Nicodemus, Editor-in-Chief at Compliance Week. This is the podcast where we unpack some of the top stories in Compliance Week, maybe take a look down the road at some of the stories that might be coming up, and generally get Aaron's thoughts on the last month and what's upcoming in Compliance Week. We also try to solve the world's problems when we can talk. So I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Aaron Nicodemus, Editor-in-Chief at Compliance Week. Tom, thanks for having me here today. I'm thrilled to join you to bring some of the top stories that we're following at Compliance Week and also to understand some of the features that we're working on. In today's episode, we're going to look back at the top stories from September at Compliance Week and preview stories and events that are coming forward in October and into the fall.
Aaron, can maybe we start with what were 2 or 3 of the top stories that stood out for you from September in Compliance?
Sure. So right now, this week, we are rolling out a 3-day case study by data and research journalist Ali McDevitt. She is writing about Lafarge, which is a French cement maker that had a plant in Syria, and then to keep it running, began paying bribes to terrorist groups in order to allow safe transport of materials and employees, and to basically keep the operation running. We are looking at what lessons that other companies could learn who are operating in similarly dangerous environments as to maybe at what point they might have said, we need to pack up and leave because it's too dangerous for us to be operating here, and the risks of us having to pay bribes in order to keep in business are too large.
So, Aaron, this story is incredibly prescient at this point in time under this administration with some of its enforcement priorities, particularly around cartels in Mexico, Latin and Central America, and their designation as foreign terrorist organizations. Do you think you and your team, or Ali, I guess, would be able to draw out some real lessons for today's compliance professionals from a case that happened, I think, in the last decade?
Yes. The events of this case were in 2012 to 2014 into operations in an area where the political environment is changing rapidly, right? Syria, when they built a factory in Syria in 2010, Lafarge saw a relatively calm country that was ruled by an autocratic dictatorship, right? So they thought they could be safe enough to have a $610 million plant operate safely. Then civil war happened, and they started to make a series of small concessions that eventually led to them having to pay bribes in order to stay in operation. And what we would like to tease out over the next couple of weeks are stories about similar decisions that have to be made in areas where the political climate is changing. And I'm looking at places like Venezuela, I'm looking at Mexico, I'm looking at Central America, and there are other parts of the world as well where the political climate is changing really fast, and it may be too dangerous for companies to operate in some parts of those countries, or at least they need to start taking very serious discussions about how to reduce their risk of paying, either inadvertently or on purpose, a foreign terrorist criminal organization in order to keep their business going.
Aaron, you just mentioned that this article or series of articles will come out over the next several weeks. Could you maybe explain the reason for having it come out as a series or multiple articles over multiple issues of what I would used to call the magazine, but I guess we would now call the online presence?
So the idea is, I was reporting on a story about emerging risks in Mexico back in August, and I had some of my sources sort of unbeknownst to them that we were doing this case study on Lafarge, pointing back to Lafarge and saying, if you want to understand the risks you're taking doing business in some parts of Mexico, in Venezuela, and some other countries. Look at what happened with the Lafarge case in Syria. Very similar, potentially very similar scenarios where the political situation sort of unravels much quicker than you're expecting. And the U.S. government is declared a bunch of cartels as foreign terrorist groups. And then if you are paying bribes to them or paying bribes to organizations, companies that are connected to them in some way, you could run into the crosshairs of DOJ enforcement. And that is a much bigger risk than I think corporations have expected that they are taking to do business in places like Mexico up until very recently.
So what are some of the other stories that either started or you've got your eye on from September, Aaron?
Yeah, so one story that has sort of popped up again from the past is this Jeffrey Epstein case study that Allie did about 18 months ago. In that case study, she examined how JPMorgan Chase and Deutsche Bank supported Jeffrey Epstein's criminal activities, or at least facilitated them. The New York Times came out with a story on this very same topic using many of the same sources just a week ago, and we have been reporting on the differences between our case study and the New York Times reporting, and also on sort of the response from the public at large about this Epstein case, which doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
You have now mentioned Allie's name twice. Could you say a few words about her unique role at Compliance Week and how you're able to use her for both of these fabulous stories?
Yeah, so Allie, we have the ability and the resources at Compliance Week to allow her to really get in depth in some of these topics that many of us, myself as a reporter just a month ago, would cover a week or so. We'd interview a few sources and then we'd move on to the next story. What Allie is able to do in her position is dig much deeper into some of these topics and explore documentation, explore case studies, and search out witnesses who may, or I would call them sources, who may understand the case better than I would or that the general public would, and also take the time to sort of develop them and build confidence that their story will not be distorted, that their story will be told in the way that is accurate and respectful. So doing all that means that we're able to provide deeper insights into these topics that are on the top of mind of compliance officers than we might have been able to do with typical day-to-day or week-to-week news coverage.
Aaron, were there any stories over the past month that really caught your eye that you guys were able to report on?
Yeah, so we had a story by our European correspondent, Ruth Prickett, on digital wallets. And basically, there's a lot of interest in Europe, particularly, of having all of your documentation available in a digital wallet. So your passport, your license, your birth certificate, other personal information can be made available in just this digital form so that it can be scanned easily and quickly by authorities. And the idea is that it can move you through airports at a little faster clip. And then on top of that, then would you be adding, say, your bank account information or some other personal information, your home address, into this digital wallet? The story, two stories that we wrote, explore some of the risks for companies and for individuals who are accessing these digital wallets and what it means for compliance, but also what it means for sort of the future of data privacy and trying to understand how to keep these documents from falling into the wrong hands or being misused in some way.
I know Europe and the United Kingdom are far ahead of the United States in a lot of areas in digital, but this seems to me to coalesce the joint issues of data privacy and data protection in one story in a way that I haven't heard in a long time. Any real insights as to whether this sort of digital wallet could come to America?
I think it could, and I think it's farther away in the U.S. as a use by government, but I think it is closer in the U.S. for use by, say, financial institutions as a way to make banking even more free and seamless. And there are a lot of apps that users could potentially use to try and smooth some of these transactions out with private sources, not with the government, but with banks, financial institutions, that kind of thing. And so when you're considering putting your personal information out there in order to, say, complete a financial transaction, cryptocurrency transaction, or just a typical bank transfer, right? Understanding who the partner is, who actually has your data, is, I think, going to be an issue that is really going to have to be understood, and perhaps the government may have to get involved in setting regulation for it, because right now it's really wide open. You can share your information this way, and it's stored by an app, and you're not exactly sure how that app or the company that the app is using to process the information is protecting that information. So yes, it is sort of this combination of data privacy and data protection concerns, but in the US, it's probably going to come from the private sector before the government.
Were there any enforcement actions that intrigued you over the past month or two?
Yeah, so when you remember it, maybe at the beginning of this year, when Trump came into office, there was this idea that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was paused, right? And that the government wasn't going to launch new investigations. That has turned out to be not quite as black and white as we thought. What the Department of Justice has done is go back, reassess some FCPA cases that were in process, perhaps not completed, and either dropping them or reducing the penalty down to very little. And some companies that had decided, hey, this might be a good time to come forward and tell the government about investigations that we did, maybe we could get a more lenient decision from the government. And we are seeing that happening. So Liberty Mutual had a series of FCPA violations that it discovered through an internal investigation. It self-disclosed those violations to the DOJ, and the DOJ came back and said, we like that you self-disclosed. We like that you took all of these actions, even as you were reporting it to us, to prevent that from happening again. And so they issued, I think it was a $4.5 million fine, very small for an FCPA action. And they did not issue Liberty Mutual a compliance monitor. There have been a couple other examples of that similar happening where the government, the DOJ is basically saying, we don't want to be involved in fixing the problem within your company. We want you to fix the problem and show us that it's fixed, and then we're done. We're out of it. They're not looking to continually monitor companies for compliance with, say, an FCPA code of conduct. And that's a change, and that's a pretty big pivot, and we're starting to see how they're treating that in some of these cases.
Aaron, recognizing that one case does not a trend make, nevertheless, from the corporate side of things, do you see a real incentive for a self-disclosure, a extensive remediation, and an aggressive cooperation leading to a lower fine and penalty, or even perhaps a declination if the situation meets it?
I think that there is certainly an appetite within this Department of Justice to take Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations as mistakes that should be fixed, but also that coming forward and admitting the mistakes brings with it a certain amount of possibility that a declination or a lower fine would be the end result. Every case is different, right? Any lawyer will tell you that the specifics of a case are only as good as the facts that are presented. However, overall, the DOJ is encouraging companies to self-report these violations, and at least with the slow trickle of things that we've seen so far, they're willing to be more lenient than the previous administration in the enforcement action.
Aaron, could it be that with less enforcement, you could actually have the anomaly of more pressure on compliance programs to first detect, but then prevent any violations?
Yeah, I think that's a real issue. The DOJ and really all of government is talking about not just self-disclosure, but self-policing. This is an issue that compliance has long grappled with. It's like, how do you encourage your leadership to follow the law to the nth degree, to follow it to the letter of the law, instead of saying, if the enforcement is not as strong as it used to be, maybe we don't need to pay as much attention to this. I think actually it's the opposite, because, and again, we have not seen this yet, but I'm expecting that there will be a case where the DOJ discovers that, say, a company is paying bribes to a Mexican cartel, for example, and either they knew it or perhaps they suspected it but didn't take any action. In that case, if they do not self-disclose to the DOJ, I think the DOJ is going to come down like a hammer on that company for those violations. In this environment, I don't see any reason to think that the DOJ wouldn't do that. They want you to come forward, report the violation, and fix it. And if they find it, I think it could be a much bigger problem.
Well, that's a trend I hope we can follow over the next several podcasts, and that you and your team will follow in the publication as well.
I suspect we will.
So what do you have maybe you could either tease us with or highlight upcoming for the month of October, and maybe even a little bit beyond into Q4?
Sure. Our next big issue or series coming forward is we'll be asking compliance officers to answer our Inside the Mind of the CCO survey, which we will launch in October, and then the results of that will come out in late November, early December. And for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, Inside the Mind of the CCO asks a series of questions to compliance officers about what are some of the big things on their minds. It also asks about salary. It also asks about if they're seeing trends within the profession that we should be paying attention to. And in the past, Inside the Mind has discovered things like environmental, social, and governance, ESG issues are on the wane, and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement is on the rise. And then in a following survey, we would find the opposite, or we would find that they were moving in a different direction. Some of the through lines, though, that we've seen is that, number one, compliance officers still really enjoy their jobs. That is something that we've seen in 6 years of Inside the Mind of the CCO, and I expect we'll see it in the 7th. And the other is that data privacy and data protection has only grown more and more important to compliance officers. It's become a bigger part of their sort of plate of responsibilities, and that seems to be continuing. I suspect that will be continuing in our 7th survey.
So beyond the survey first of all, this is one of the top events, not for Compliance Week, for compliance. First, you guys gathering the data and then the reporting of it. It's things that you'll be talking about for several months, and indeed the compliance community will be talking about literally until the next survey. So it's a huge part of the compliance community beyond simply Compliance Week. Are there any stories you might be able to tease us with, or anything that you guys are working on a little longer term beyond Allie's stories?
Yes, absolutely. Adrian Appel is a reporter for us who is looking at a couple of trends that she should be reporting on in the next week or so. One of them is on healthcare compliance, and I'm talking specifically about the FCA, the False Claims Act. The DOJ and other enforcement agencies within this Trump administration have focused like a laser on healthcare fraud. It is a priority for them. Now, FCA enforcement has always been a big deal in the healthcare field, but apparently there are some new avenues that the DOJ is looking into for enforcement actions in healthcare fraud. But the big ones are the usual suspects, right? Medicare and Medicaid fraud, and they're spending more time investigating and prosecuting those cases. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming months, and Adrian is working on a story that is going to discuss that in more detail. The other story that we're looking at that Adrian is reporting on has to do with immigration. And so, as everyone knows, the Trump administration has made immigration enforcement probably one of its biggest priorities, and workplaces are being raided on a regular basis. I see stories about Home Depot parking lots being raided and Korean automakers in Georgia. The story that we're looking to understand is, how should compliance be, number one, trying to figure out if they have an issue with immigration documentation within their workforce, and number two, what should they be doing to prepare their leadership if such a raid came forth, or if there was some concern that they had employees who didn't have the documentation that might be targeted by the Trump administration. So that's a story that she's also reporting on, trying to come at it from the idea of what compliance officers should be doing in preparation for enforcement actions.
And typically, as we move towards Q4 and into the holiday season, things tended to slow down a little bit. But I think this year it's not going to slow down, given the pace of change we've seen in literally the first 9 months. I think you guys are going to be very busy coming up.
Yeah, I feel that way as well. Every day, every week, there's some new issue that sort of gets turned on its head. An enforcement priority of the previous administration that's either gets defanged or amped up. It is actually going in both directions at the same time, and keeping pace has proven to be practically a full-time job, even though there are lots of other things and areas in compliance that we should be focusing on. What the U.S. government is doing in enforcement is, of course, top of mind for most of us.
Aaron, you have a conference coming up in January entitled The Leading Edge, Applying AI and Data Analytics in E&C. And at this point, I was just wanted to ask you if you could just tease a little bit about what this conference is and how a potential speaker might apply if they chose to do so.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, we have this conference coming up. We had a conference in Boston in 2024 about AI use and compliance, and at that point it was still fairly new to most compliance officers. This conference, most compliance officers have been exposed to AI use either within their companies or they're actually applying it to their use. And so this conference is going to be much more about hands-on understanding how AI could be used in your operations, how it could be used against you, how you can also actualize the ideas that your team has for finding efficiencies or finding new ways to monitor transactions. The idea is let's get compliance officers in a room and talk about how AI is actually being used, and then also offer some alternatives and some ideas on how AI could potentially make your job easier. That's the idea. And speakers, what we're looking for are people who have already dabbled in AI and can come and tell us their war stories. It's not all bad news with AI, but it's not all good news either. And what we want to hear is, we went to our company and we applied an AI tool to this particular compliance task, and here was the result, right? This is how it worked. And our conferences are always Chatham House rule, which means that Compliance Week, while it's a news organization, is not going to report on the particulars of what people are talking about or the questions that are being asked. This is a safe space for compliance officers to come and discuss their war stories, discuss what went right, and discuss what didn't go right, and allow other compliance officers to take that back to their teams and say, I heard this at the leading edge, and I think we should do it. Or I heard this at the leading edge, and we're currently doing it, but I hadn't thought about this problem that we should address.
Well, Aaron, I think we unfortunately are near the end of our time for this episode. Once again, a great episode. Any final thoughts or that you wanted to share with our audience?
No, my final thought really is that the Compliance Week is working very hard to understand the pain points for compliance officers, and we're looking to build conversations with compliance officers. We have a product called CW Connect, which I encourage any compliance officer to join. It's a place where compliance officers can have conversations with each other about these issues in compliance, and they can ask each other honest questions about how they solve problems. We're having our first live events on CW Connect this week, and we expect we'll be rolling them out as the year goes on.
Aaron, as always, thank you very much for joining me for this. I am Tom Fox.
And I'm Nicodemus. Thanks for having me.